Howdy y'all. Today we're going to be talking about some of the weird tanks from World War II. Now there's a lot of material to talk about if we want to talk about weird tanks from this period or weird tanks in general, but we're going to talk about 4 tanks today. This will be a little bit of a shorter episode, and we'll probably do more videos like this in the future. Like I said, there's a lot of material to choose from. These are going to be prototypes, vehicles that were actually built, not just something on paper, and that should be pretty interesting as well. I want to say real quick, this is a little bit of a side note, but it looks like my video last week was throttled. If you'd like to check that out and maybe try and beat the algorithm a little bit, that'd be great. It looks like YouTube really hindered its distribution after a couple days. So anyway, just wanted to mention that, and also want to mention real quick that if you like what you're seeing with the Kentuckian and you'd like to stay in tune with what's going on, make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Now, let's get to the tanks. The first tank I want to talk about today is the M6 heavy tank. Now, the United States was not known for its heavy tank production during World War II. However, they did actually produce a factory production heavy tank, and that's the M6. The M6 was designed kind of in response to the heavy tanks of World War II. Just one of those things as people realized, oh, the tanks that we built in World War I or the interwar period aren't really practical, and designs changed. The United States looked into producing a heavy tank. It mounted the powerful 76mm anti-tank gun that we've talked about already, and it had a 37mm gun, which was the same 37mm on the M3 and the M5 Stuart tanks, mounted coaxially. Now, what that means, if you see, you should see on some of the pictures, there's a little barrel right next to the main gun. That's the coaxially mounted 37mm. You think about coaxial, coaxis, the same axis of movement, basically where the main gun moved, the 37mm would move as well. It was about 57 tons combat loaded, which is a pretty heavy tank for the time. There were a few that were heavier, but even the Tiger I came in at around 55 tons. It also had 2 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the hull kind of together. If you see on the pictures, the 2 barrels there on the hull of the tank, those are the 50 cals. That's an armor plate connecting them. They're kind of used almost as one unit, which is kind of an odd feature. You don't see that very often. And I've also read that it had 2 30 caliber machine guns that were bow mounted. Now, I've looked and I haven't been able to find exactly where these machine guns were. So if somebody in the comments could give me some information or point me in the right direction on some information to that, maybe y'all can help me out a little bit. The M6 was a very tall tank. You can tell from the pictures it's very, very big, just in general. It's tall, it's wide, it's long, it's a big tank. Its armor was okay. It ranged from 25 to 83 millimeters, and that was fairly solid, but it still wouldn't have been enough to stop the more powerful German guns consistently. There were tanks that focused a lot on armor, and they tended to be very slow and very unreliable, and there were very big disadvantages of having extremely heavily armored tanks. The layout for the crew on the M6 was reportedly quite poor, and the coaxial 37mm, while it was being tested, was reported as useless. And that makes sense. Mid to late war, the 37mm was pretty obsolete. It did show up on some light tanks and some scout cars and stuff, where in specific instances against armor, it could be okay. But it just was not up to snuff by mid to late war standards. The M6 was also not super reliable, and it was officially accepted as a tank by the military. So usually if it's still a prototype or an experimental tank, it has T in front of it instead of an M. Well, the M6 has the M in front of it. It was accepted, but there are only about 40 of them produced. Originally the contract was much larger. It kept getting kind of pared down, and by the time the M6 was available, the military determined they didn't really need it. The Sherman would serve well enough for the purposes they needed at the moment, and that they could see in the future. And as we talked about in the American Tank video, they constantly upgraded and made the Sherman better. And logistically, the M6 would have been a lot harder to deal with, from the weight to when you're talking about loading it and unloading it on ships, and even the size of it, because the footprint of a Sherman and the space it takes up had already been accounted for, and how it fits inside transport ships and that sort of stuff. It just wasn't super practical or necessary. It was used mainly for testing, and in fact, I'll show you, you'll see a picture here of one of the kind of test experimental versions of the M6 they made, and it was used for war bond drives and stuff like that. Never left U.S. soil. it was a fine heavy tank by the standards, but we didn't need it overseas. Kind of an interesting vehicle there. But that is also the only vehicle that was actually a production vehicle we're going to talk about today. The next one I want to talk about is perhaps the best known on this list, actually, and that's the Panzer VIII Mouse. Now, I do want to take a brief moment to explain something. The brief correction that I want to make has to do with the Tiger tanks. In the video on German tanks, I said that the Tiger II was the Panzer VII and the Tiger I was the Panzer VI. What is correct there, and thank you to the commenter that helped point me in this right direction where I got mixed up, the Panzer VI was the Tiger I. The Tiger II was known as the Panzerkampfwagen, and then they have a AUSF-B is one of the main actual designations that it had. Panzer VII was a separate tank that was never actually really built. So anyway, just want to make that brief correction there, and thanks again to the commenter that helped point me in that direction. The Panzer VIII Mouse was a prototype super heavy tank that was built by Germany during the war, and it's the heaviest enclosed tank in history. Now, while it was built, this was just a prototype. It was never a full production tank. The vehicle, when it was fully finished, was 188 tons. So we just talked about the M6. Pretty heavy for the time. It was 57 tons. The heaviest vehicles, like the Jagdtiger, which was the heaviest production vehicle in World War II, which we did talk about, very heavy tank destroyer, came in at about 68 tons. The Tiger II was, I believe, 66. That's basically as heavy as it got. And the Panzer VIII Mouse, or the Mouse super heavy tank, was basically almost 3 times as heavy as that. Massively heavy tank. It was armed with a very large and very powerful 128 millimeter anti-tank gun, and it had, just like the M6 had a coaxial 37 millimeter, the Mouse had a coaxial 75 millimeter howitzer. It had about 200 millimeters of armor over much of the vehicle. The slight differences: 220 on the front of the turret, 180 in some spots. The weakest armor on the Mouse was at the rear of the hull with 150 millimeters of armor. This amount of armor, that 200 or so millimeters across the entire tank, would have made it virtually impervious to any gun that it would come against, or almost any gun that it would come against. It was a crazy amount of armor, of course, extremely heavy. It was extremely slow, as you can probably imagine, and there was not a bridge in Germany that could support the weight of the Mouse. It was technically designed to wade, to be able to go through certain amounts of water, since bridges weren't an option, right? No bridge could support its weight. But practically, the weight of the vehicle and the low amount of power that the engine gave it meant that it would have been, realistically, if they'd ever tried to cross many rivers, impossible. But that was what it was meant to do. 2 hulls and a single turret for the Mouse were produced. Again, these were prototypes, but there were those things produced, and 1 finished vehicle was produced out of one of the turrets and one of the hulls. It's unclear whether the Mouse ever saw combat, but reports say that it saw combat in the last days of fighting in World War II and the desperate fighting in Berlin when the Russians were attacking. But it's really it's not 100% known, by the way. Now, the next vehicle is a British tank. It's the A39 Tortoise heavy assault tank. Now, the heavy assault tank, the Tortoise, was a vehicle designed by the British to take on heavy fortifications more than anything. It was feared that when the invasion of Europe happened, that the large defensive structures that had been built or had been occupied by Germany in Europe would provide a significant problem to Allied forces. So there were many options looked into. To the one of particular interest to us is the heavy assault tank, in this case the Tortoise. Now, the Tortoise was a little bit lighter than the Mouse at 78 tons, but still extremely heavy by World War II standards. It had a pretty good amount of armor, ranging from 177 to 228 millimeters. It would have been very hard to penetrate, although its armor was set up differently than like the Mouse's, because the way the armor is produced and the slope of the armor, those things do affect the effectiveness of it. It was armed with a 32-pounder, which was a 94 millimeter OQF, or Ordnance Quick Firing Gun, that was quite powerful. And in testing, that 32-pounder could still knock out a Panther tank at 1,000 yards, when the Panther tank had very good armor. And to be able to penetrate and knock out a vehicle at that range is very, very impressive. It was, as with all the vehicles in this video, pretty slow, but it was actually decently reliable. which was honestly a difficult feat to pull off with a vehicle of that weight from the time. Just having that much weight on a chassis of any kind was difficult to make reliable. There's just so much strain put on the parts. But it probably would have served decently well, actually, if it had ever been deployed. I think there were only 2 prototypes built. There is one that still survives at the tank factory, or the tank museum, excuse me, in Bovington, England. Oh, and I should have mentioned on the mouse that there is one prototype is still around at one of the tank museums in Russia. I believe it's the Kubinka Tank Museum. The next and the last vehicle that I want to talk about is an American vehicle, and it's an American heavy assault tank called the T28 Super Heavy tank. Now, this vehicle is basically the American version of the Tortoise. It was to serve a similar role, right? The similar idea, deal with heavy fortifications. It was armed with a 105 millimeter gun that was known to perform quite well against concrete, so they figured that mounting it on this vehicle would be very effective at taking out fortifications. It was very well armored. Actually, it was, I guess, in many ways, the best armored vehicle in this list. It had 305 millimeters of armor at the front, maximum armor at the front, and it weighed a whopping 95 tons. So it's still not near as much as the mouse, but it was pretty heavy compared to any other vehicle except the mouse on this list. It was also very slow, as you can imagine, and only 2 prototypes were built. There were 2 prototypes built, though. Interesting thing, it was originally designated as a heavy tank, and some of the people in the military didn't really like that because it didn't have a turret. So it was redesignated to the 105 millimeter gun motor carriage, T95, or just the T95 as you may hear it referred to. But then some people didn't really like that because most of the gun motor carriages, as we've talked about in the American tank video, were very lightly armored, fairly lightly armored, and they're fast, and they usually have a turret. So then it was redesignated again into the T28 Super Heavy tank. That's kind of an interesting thing with the designation because nobody really knew where to put it. No other vehicle like that had been produced. So that's kind of what it ended with, was the T28. Very interesting vehicle. I think it's a very cool looking vehicle, and never saw action as with basically all of these vehicles, but it was an interesting concept. It was tested for several years during and after the war, and then they scrapped one of them that had gotten destroyed or damaged in testing, and then the other one is actually somewhere still in the U.S. It used to be at the Tank Museum in Fort Knox, Kentucky, but that basically all those vehicles have moved, so I don't believe it's there anymore. I'm not sure where it is now. Anyway, that is all we have for our video today. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Don't forget about all the social media that we have as we finish our video here. If you'd like to keep up with what's going on with the Kentuckian, and if you'd like to support me in a more personal way, my Patreon is also linked in the description of this video, as well as the social media links that I mentioned a moment ago. Don't forget about our merchandise shop either. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this whole world. It's been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.